Hello and welcome to this short lecture on datafication in the public sector. I'll talk about this from an organizational point of view, which means that I'll reflect on how data becomes something that public organizations increasingly have to deal with on an entirely new level and in new ways, and how data actually becomes intertwined with a lot of different organizational phenomena and discourses. First, I'll try to give you an idea about what is special about the public sector as a context for digitalization. And I'll do that by introducing the idea of digital era governance. And then I'll talk briefly about the new status of data as such, which also influences how data is approached in a public sector context. And finally, I'll share some empirical examples of how data becomes a very important part of organizational practices, something that takes up time and so on and so forth, in many different ways in practice. But let's start with this concept of digital era governance. What does it mean to talk about a new paradigm in governance? It means that some new logics are emerging about how we steer and organize public organizations. And it has been argued that digital era governance replaces new public management as a paradigm, or at least is an addition to new public management, which has otherwise dominated the reforms made in the public sector for the past decades. And new public management was very much about implementing management ideals and practices from the private sector. For instance, more performance measures in single organizations, competition between organizations in connection with privatization, and thus, all in all, a kind of compartmentalization or fragmentation of the public sector. So this has led to a public sector that is perceived often as organized in silos with very little connection between organizations and domains. And that means, for instance, for citizens that the data that they enter in one type of public organization is not visible to another, so they have to enter data all over again. And the impression is sometimes that one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. But here, the gradual transformation from analog public organizations to digitized public organizations offers entirely new possibilities for reforming the public sector. And that's why we talk about a new paradigm in governance. A new situation where we can save and systematize and reuse and share data, so that it becomes possible to connect formally separated units or silos, as I talked about, through digital platforms and data. And obviously, there are ethical and legal boundaries for what can be stored and what can be shared, and so on and so forth. But the ideal is to create better and more holistic public services, for instance, with self-service, online self-service solutions, where that draws on a lot of different data that the public sector has collected on you as a citizen. We may talk about a paradigm because there's a transformation of an entire sector going on, based on a number of ideals, promises, discourses, practices, and so on, where digitalization is seen as a basis for increased efficiency, higher quality, better service for citizens, higher transparency, more trust in the public sector, and also more responsible and empowered citizens, because they get new ways of serving themselves and accessing their own data, for instance. But as we know, ideals and practice are not always overlapping. So although many states have actually already thoroughly digitized their administrations and their interfaces with citizens, and although they have managed to increase efficiency and quality, we can also see that in practice, digitalization has a number of unintended consequences. And those sort of organizational consequences and implications and so on and so forth, that's the topic of organizational research that deals with digitalization in the public sector. I'm going to return to that in the end of this talk. But I've mostly talked about digitalization for now and not so much about data. So let's turn to that, because we can actually begin to talk about a datafied public sector, or a public sector where there's a pressure to become more data-driven and better at harvesting the benefits of having all the data on citizens that many states have. We can talk about a data revolution discourse that has been very powerful for at least the past decade. Of course, we've always used data to understand the world and make decisions and so on and so forth. But the idea of data-driven decision-making and so on has become much more popular, so to say. And this data revolution discourse is a very good example of that in McAfee and Brynjolfsson's article, Big Data, the Management Revolution, from Harvard Business Review, where they want to test their hypothesis whether data-driven decisions are better for organizational performance. And this article is full of examples of them stating that they see their hypothesis confirmed, and they recommend that we move into a new kind of decision-making culture that is less based on experience and instinct and intuition and so on, and more on asking what the data says. As they put it, an effective organization puts information and the relevant decision rights in the same location. You can say that this comes together with a change in the status of knowledge and a change in the status of data. You would say, back in the 1980s, where we talked about knowledge society and knowledge management and so on a lot, data would have a relatively low position in the hierarchy, being the foundation for systematizing and creating information, which would then be a foundation for humans sort of developing knowledge and in the end making decisions. And whereas today data is seen as being able to sort of inform decision making directly, as McAfee and Brynjolfsson say, data and decisions have to be put in the same place, so to say, so that when we have data, we also have our decision. So this whole new discourse and the new status that data has in society and organization general also really informs how public organizations operate and what public managers think that they need to work with. And now I want to turn to the final part of my presentation, which is about this organizational approach to datafication that I talked about in the beginning. I want to give you some examples from me and my colleague Lisa Justessen's work on digitalization in the public sector, where we try to look into this digital era governance paradigm and the digitalization agenda in the Danish public sector. How is that realized in organizational practices? And we saw that data and datafication is a big thing. It's a big concern with public managers, and something that takes up a lot of organizational resources. So in the chapter that I mentioned here on the slide, we talk about all the different ways that data emerge as an organizational phenomenon in different sites. We had the assumption, we borrowed this expression cross-cutting and diverse from anthropologist Marilyn Strathern, and this means we had the assumption that we would find a phenomenon, let's say such as datafication, as being cross-cutting, being present in many, many different public organizations, something that many different public managers would take very seriously, but also that their ways of doing that would be diverse. So we try to maintain this understanding of data and datafication in the public sector as being cross-cutting and diverse. And I'm going to look in my examples in a minute on the many diverse ways that data emerge in different sites in the public sector. We find this useful because it moves from it helps us move from data and datafication as being very grand phenomena to being a part of everyday practices and practiced in different ways in organizations. So, one of the sites that we visited as part of our empirical investigations was the Danish Agency of Digitization, and they really drive the digitization agenda in the Danish public sector. So they were interesting to talk to, and there for them data was portrayed very much as a foundation. Data is simply the foundation for all the wonderful digitalization initiatives that we see in the public sector. As they said in an interview, our entire administration is based on basic data. And in Denmark, we've had personal identification numbers, for instance, since '68, and that gives some unique opportunities for collecting data about citizens and correlating them and so on and so forth. And as they say in there, good registries are a foundation for digitalization. That also means that nations who have sort of more concern with privacy and who don't collect information in the same way as we do in Denmark, they have other conditions for digitalization. In the same site, in the Danish Agency for Digitization, we saw a portrayal of data as a connector, as something that should be able to float freely among organizations so that they could connect the silos that I also talked about before. And there's this vision of data flowing into public IT systems and being made available to citizens and being used to create better user experiences so that data wouldn't be that difficult to access for citizens. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are some legal problems with having data float around, but that was an ideal that was pretty strong in this site. We also saw another way that data appeared in our ethnographic work in a municipal center. And here data was very much seen as an entry point to the future. We saw how the center would appoint data experts and would have numerous meetings about data-driven management. We saw how they would experiment with data visualizations and try to come up with new analysis of organizational data. And all these activities were founded on a vision on smart shortcuts to the future and on data as a basis for decisions. So here you see that close connection to the data revolution discourse that I talked about before. That was very present among managers in this particular public organization. In the same municipal center, we observed that besides all these activities that had to do with making better decisions and being better at predicting the future and so on and so forth, we also saw that data became a very mundane, practical, everyday problem, because we observed countless meetings on how data should be used and on workflows and process descriptions, on data security and risk analysis relating to data, and on GDPR. And we saw that new policies in the public sector and new technologies entering the public sector would all the time produce changing conditions for working with data. And we saw that, in a sense, issues relating to data security and data storage and data quality and so on, they cannot really be solved once and for all, because reality is dynamic. So data about reality and the ways that data need to be handled and so on is also dynamic. So it really takes a lot of organizational effort to deal with data in practice. And this is maybe a discourse that you don't see that often, let's say, in policy statements and visions about digitalization and datafication. And then in the same center, where we did observe a lot of meetings and a lot of work, we saw that data was sometimes not really an access to the future, as it can otherwise be portrayed, but sometimes simply old news. Because sometimes data analysts would come into the organization and begin to look into systems and come up with ideas for what they could analyze. And then managers would have this knowledge already. They would have known data and used data for ages. So there was a tension between the people who were very familiar with the organization and the people who entered the organization through data, so to say. And this made managers sometimes portray data as old news, as something we knew already, and then basically as a waste of time to engage in analyzing. Then finally, there is an organization that an association of all the municipalities in Denmark called Local Government Denmark, who are very concerned with technological development, and they had some very radical ways of portraying data in their communication material, where they saw more decisions in the public sector being generated directly from data. Now, just to take a very mundane example that doesn't have to do with any important decisions, let's just say that a garbage bin can communicate directly that it's full and it can be automatically emptied, something like that, to start with. Of course, you can envisage later on that more advanced decisions are generated directly from data. So that was kind of a more futurist approach to data. But my overall point is that there are many ways that data can appear in organizational practices and take up time and be the object of meetings and documents and work and so on and so forth. And I've just collected the ones here because we saw them in different sites, all these different ways that data emerge in organizational practices, but they can of course also emerge in the same site, in the same organization. That's an open question. And I thought, as a way of discussing some of these issues that I have been talking about, you could, if you look at this list, you could begin to think about, in a specific public organization, if you could find examples of data giving access to the future in new ways. If you could find examples of data being hyped, despite being old news to some organizational actors. If you could find examples of data contributing to breaking down silos or being a resource demanding practical legal issue demanding extra work. Or if you could find examples of low data quality being a barrier for digitalization, or as data driving decisions and initiatives. And the list could, of course, be made longer. But my overall point is here that data is not just a resource to be harvested and used to produce value or an automatic access to better decisions, but data emerges in many different ways in organizational settings, and they need to be handled on a daily basis in many different ways. So my conclusion would be, with the datafication paradigm that gives rise to ambitious digitalization agendas in the public sector, it becomes increasingly important to reflect on how data enters the organization and alters the organization's way of working. Thanks for your attention.